The first time I heard this story, it wasn't told to me. It slipped into my mind quietly, like a thought that didn't belong there. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow hum of the night, when a sentence appeared in my head as clearly as if someone had whispered it in my ear. It felt old, heavy, and wrong. The strange part wasn't the words themselves. It was the feeling that came with them, the sense that this bedtime story had once been important, then buried on purpose, and now it had found its way back. This is the kind of story people don't mean to remember. It's the kind that's told softly, with the lights off, when the world feels safe enough to sleep. The kind that parents stop halfway through and replace with something happier. The kind you forget as you grow older, or at least you think you do. But some stories don't disappear. They wait. They settle deep inside memory, blending with dreams, until one quiet night they rise again, asking to be heard. When I was a child, bedtime was the only time the house ever felt honest. During the day, everything was noise, voices, rules, routines. At night, the truth came out in whispers. The walls seemed thinner, shadows stretched longer, and stories felt real. My mother used to sit at the edge of my bed, smoothing the blanket with one hand, holding a book in the other. She had a calm voice, the kind that could slow your breathing without you noticing. Most nights, she read the same gentle tales everyone knows. Brave children, kind animals, happy endings. But there was one story she only told once. I remember asking for it again. I remember the way her face changed when I did. She didn't look angry. She looked afraid. She told me it was just a silly story, something she made up because she was tired. She said it didn't mean anything and that I shouldn't think about it anymore. Then she kissed my forehead, turned off the light, and left the room faster than usual. That should have been the end of it. And for years it was. I forgot the words. I forgot the details. I even forgot that I had ever asked about it. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Because forgetting doesn't always mean something is gone. Sometimes it just means it's hiding. As an adult, I tried to live a normal life. I stayed busy. I filled my days with work, my nights with screens, my silence with noise. But every so often, usually just before sleep, I felt it again. A pressure behind my thoughts. A sense that something was missing. On those nights, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, my dreams were never clear. They felt unfinished, like someone had stopped telling a story halfway through. That was when the memories began to return. Not all at once. Not clearly. Just fragments. A dark room. A child's bed. A voice lowering as it reached a certain part. A rule I didn't understand, but somehow knew I wasn't supposed to break. The more I tried to ignore these thoughts, the stronger they became. It was as if the story itself was reminding me that it still existed. I started to wonder if other people carried forgotten bedtime stories too. Stories told to them once and never again. Stories meant to comfort, but instead planted something unsettling. Stories that felt like warnings rather than entertainment. The idea bothered me more than it should have. It felt personal, like the story was tied not just to my childhood, but to who I was now. One night, unable to sleep, I called my mother. We talked about ordinary things at first. Weather, family, time passing too quickly. Then there was a pause. The kind of pause where you can feel a conversation shifting. I asked her if she remembered the story she used to tell me, the one she never finished. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded older than I remembered. She told me she didn't know what I was talking about. She laughed softly and said I must be mixing it up with something else. But I could hear it in her breathing. The tension. The effort it took to sound casual. That was when I realized something important. She remembered it too. Some stories aren't forgotten because they're boring or unimportant. They're forgotten because remembering them feels dangerous. Because they carry ideas we aren't ready to face. Because they change the way we see ourselves. That bedtime story wasn't just a story. It was a message. And whatever it was trying to say, it was something my mother hoped I would never understand. The theme of the story, at least what little I could recall, was simple. It was about a child who couldn't sleep. A child who listened too closely to the world at night. The house in the story wasn't haunted. There were no monsters under the bed. There was just a feeling that the night itself was paying attention. That it remembered things people wanted to forget. As a kid, that idea scared me in a quiet way. Not enough to scream or cry, but enough to lie still, holding my breath, wondering if the darkness was listening. As an adult, it scared me even more, because I understood what it meant. It wasn't about night. It was about memory, about the past watching us, waiting for us to acknowledge it. I tried to piece together the story from what little I remembered. Each attempt felt like tugging on a loose thread. The more I pulled, the more uneasy I became. I started noticing small details around me that felt connected, though I couldn't explain how. Old phrases I'd always avoided. Certain songs I never liked hearing before bed. Even the way I positioned myself when I slept, always facing the door, always leaving a small light on. These habits hadn't come from nowhere. They were learned, taught, planted by a story told once and never meant to be repeated. The idea that a simple bedtime story could shape a life sounds strange. But stories are powerful, especially the ones we hear when we're half asleep, when our minds are open and unguarded. That's when ideas slip in without resistance. That's when fears take root. That's when truths can be hidden in plain sight. As I kept digging, the story grew clearer in my mind, but also more distorted. Some parts felt solid, like they had always been there. Others shifted every time I tried to focus on them. It was as if the story didn't want to be remembered exactly as it was. It wanted to be felt instead. Unease, curiosity, a slow, creeping sense that something was wrong. The child in the story was told a rule, not shouted, not explained, just stated calmly, as if it were obvious. The rule had something to do with remembering, or maybe forgetting. Even now, I can't say which one came first. All I know is that breaking the rule had consequences. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones. Quiet consequences that showed up years later. That's when I realized why this story was meant to be forgotten. It wasn't because it was too scary for a child. It was because it was too honest. It suggested that some things don't stay buried just because we want them to. That memories have their own will. That what we push away doesn't disappear, it waits. This story isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about the fear of remembering something you were never supposed to know. It's about childhood and how fragile it really is. It's about trust and how easily it can be broken by a few soft words spoken in the dark. As I sit here now, telling you this, I can feel the same tension I felt back then. The same hesitation. Part of me wonders if I should stop. If sharing this story is a mistake. If some things really are better left forgotten. But another part of me knows that once a story resurfaces, it demands to be finished. The truth is, I don't fully remember how the bedtime story ended, or if it ever ended at all. I only remember the moment my mother stopped speaking, the silence that followed, the way the room felt heavier, as if the air itself had changed, and the certainty deep in my chest that I had just been told something I wasn't supposed to carry into the future. And yet I did. Now the story is back, and it wants to be heard. Not as a comfort, not as a warning whispered to a child, but as a confession, a reminder, a piece of the past that refuses to stay quiet. Because some bedtime stories don't help you sleep. Some of them wake you up. And the part one remember next is the part my mother never wanted me to reach. The memory that followed didn't come gently. It arrived the way cold air slips under a door, slow but impossible to ignore. I was no longer just remembering the feeling of the story. I was remembering moments around it. The days before it was told. The way my mother seemed distracted that week. How she double-checked the locks at night. How she asked me strange questions at dinner, like whether I ever heard voices when I was alone, or if I remembered things from when I was very young. At the time, I thought it was just adult worry. Now, it felt like preparation. Our house back then wasn't unusual. A narrow hallway. Old wooden floors that creaked even when no one was walking. My bedroom was at the end, small but warm, with a window that faced the backyard. At night, the branches of the tree outside cast shapes on the wall that looked like moving hands. I used to watch them until my eyes grew heavy. That night, the night of the forgotten bedtime story, those shadows felt closer somehow, sharper. I remember asking my mother why she was telling me a new story. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said some stories find you when it's time. That answer didn't make sense then. It makes even less sense now. The story within the story began like any other bedtime tale. A child who couldn't sleep, a quiet house, a parent sitting nearby, keeping watch. But the details were too familiar. The child's room sounded like mine. The hallway sounded like ours. Even the tree outside the window was there, scratching softly against the glass as if trying to get in. As she spoke, her voice grew lower, slower, like she was choosing each word carefully. She didn't use names. She never did. She said names made stories stick too easily. Instead, she used phrases like the child and the watcher and the night. I didn't question it. Kids rarely do. We accept what we're given, especially at bedtime. The child in the story sensed that something was wrong, though nothing bad had happened yet. That feeling, that quiet tension, is what stuck with me. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. The sense that something important was being hidden just out of sight. The child was told that the night remembered things differently than people did. That it held onto moments, even when humans tried to let them go. I remember shifting under my blanket, suddenly uncomfortable. I asked my mother if the story was real. She paused, just for a second. Then she said all stories are real to someone. That line stayed with me longer than anything else. As I grew older, I noticed patterns in my mother's behavior that I had once ignored. She avoided talking about the past. Not just her childhood, but mine too. Baby photos were kept in a box, never displayed. Videos existed, but we rarely watched them. If I asked about my early years, she gave short answers. Normal answers, but never detailed ones. It wasn't that she was hiding something obvious. It was more like she was carefully editing reality, removing anything that might connect back to that night. The forgotten bedtime story became a gap in my memory, a blank space I didn't know how to fill. But gaps have edges, and edges can cut. In my dreams, the story started to take shape again. Not as words, but as images. A child sitting up in bed, listening. A door slightly open. A hallway stretching longer than it should. In these dreams, I wasn't scared. I was curious. That was the most unsettling part. Whatever the story was leading toward, I wanted to know it. I began to realize that the conflict wasn't just between remembering and forgetting. It was between protection and truth. My mother hadn't stopped telling the story because it was dangerous. She stopped because it worked. It planted something in me. And she was afraid of what would happen if it grew. The keyword that kept echoing in my mind was meant. This bedtime story was meant to be forgotten. That implies intention, choice. Someone decided that this story should disappear. Someone decided a child shouldn't carry it into adulthood. But stories don't care about intentions. I started looking for traces of it in other places. Old books, folklore, late-night radio shows that talked about strange memories and shared dreams. I noticed how often people described the same experience, a story told once, never again, that changed the way they slept forever. Different details, same feeling. That's when the mystery deepened. What if this wasn't just my story? What if it was part of something larger? A pattern of stories passed down quietly, then erased. Stories designed to teach children something without them realizing it. Stories that adults later regretted telling. The more I thought about it, the more the conflict shifted inside me. I wasn't just afraid of remembering. I was afraid of what remembering might say about my mother, about why she chose that story, about what she knew that I didn't. One afternoon, while helping her clean out a closet, I found a notebook. Old, worn. The pages were yellowed, the edges soft from use. She snatched it from my hands before I could open it. Her reaction was instant. Sharp. She apologized right away, but the damage was done. I had seen fear in her eyes again. The same fear she'd worn the night she stopped the story. She told me it was nothing important. Just old notes. Just reminders. But her hands shook as she put it away. That night, I lay awake thinking about the notebook, about the story, about the way silence had shaped my life. I wondered how many of my thoughts were truly my own. How many fears were inherited. How many memories had been guided, shaped, or softened by someone who believed they were protecting me. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a question, a challenge. It was asking whether forgetting is ever really a kindness. In the story, the child eventually notices that the watcher, the presence in the night, is not there to harm them. It's there to remember for them, to hold onto something the child will one day need. That idea frightened me more than any monster ever could. The thought that something else might be keeping my memories safe because I couldn't be trusted with them yet. As I sit with these thoughts, I can feel the story pressing closer to the surface. Details sharpening. Words forming. I know that if I let it continue, if I remember the next part, there will be no going back. The tension isn't about what happens in the story. It's about what happens to me once I fully understand it. Because the next part of the bedtime story is the part where the rule is tested. And once that rule is broken, the night starts remembering things out loud. After that realization, everything slowed down. Not in the world around me, but inside my head. Ordinary moments began to feel layered, as if something else was happening underneath them. Conversations felt incomplete. Silence felt crowded. I started noticing how often people avoided certain memories, how quickly they laughed things off when the past came too close. It made me wonder how many forgotten bedtime stories were still moving quietly through the world, shaping lives without ever being named. The main conflict wasn't loud or dramatic. It lived in hesitation, in the way I stopped myself from asking questions, in the way my mother watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. There was a shared understanding between us now, unspoken but heavy. We were both aware that something old had resurfaced, and neither of us knew what would happen if it was fully uncovered. I tried to approach the mystery from another angle. Instead of focusing on memory, I focused on behavior, on patterns. I thought about my lifelong fear of falling asleep in complete darkness, about why I hated being the last one awake in a house, about why I always felt a strange sense of responsibility at night, like I was supposed to be paying attention to something important. These weren't random traits. They were responses, reactions to a rule I had learned without understanding. The story's influence had spread quietly, becoming part of who I was. One evening, I spoke to my aunt, my mother's sister. We weren't especially close, but she had always been more open, less careful with words. I asked her what my mother was like when I was very young. She smiled at first, then hesitated. She said my mother had been protective, more than most parents, especially at night. She said there was a period when my mother barely slept, when she checked on me constantly, as if afraid something would change if she looked away. I asked her why. She said she didn't know. Or maybe she did, once, and had decided not to remember. That answer unsettled me more than silence ever could. As days passed, the forgotten bedtime story began to feel like a shared secret between generations. Not something passed down openly, but something carefully managed. Told once, then buried. Each adult trusting that the next would never dig deep enough to find it again. In my dreams, new perspectives began to appear. Sometimes I was the child in the story. Sometimes I was the parent, sitting at the edge of the bed, choosing words carefully, knowing that each sentence mattered. Those dreams were harder to shake. They forced me to consider a truth I'd been avoiding. My mother hadn't just been afraid of the story. She had been afraid of herself for telling it. The watcher in the story became clearer too. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't even a presence in the usual sense. It was attention. The act of noticing. The idea that the night, the quiet hours, remembered what the day ignored. That interpretation changed everything. It meant the danger wasn't external. It was internal. The risk wasn't that something would come for the child. It was that the child would one day remember too much. This added another layer to the conflict. If remembering was risky, forgetting was a form of control. And control, even when done with love, leaves marks. I started writing things down. Small memories. Feelings without clear origins. Snippets of dreams. I didn't label them. I didn't connect them. I just let them exist on the page. It felt like speaking softly into the dark, testing whether something would answer back. Something did. Not a voice. Not a message. Just a stronger sense of direction. Certain memories began surfacing more often than others. Moments from childhood that had always felt unimportant now carried weight. A night when the power went out. A time I woke up crying without knowing why. A phrase my mother used whenever I asked too many questions. That's not for you to worry about. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't just one night. It was part of a larger effort to guide what I worried about, what I noticed, what I remembered. Another perspective began to form in my mind, one I resisted at first. What if the story wasn't meant to scare me away from something? What if it was meant to prepare me for it? What if forgetting wasn't the original plan, but a last resort? That thought reframed everything. It suggested that something had gone wrong, that the story had been interrupted because it was working too well or too quickly, that my mother saw something in my reaction that frightened her. Not fear, but understanding. The tension grew from that possibility, because if I had understood something back then, even briefly, it meant that part of me had always known. And if that was true, then remembering now wasn't discovery. It was return. The subplot I couldn't ignore anymore was my mother's own past. Her silence wasn't empty. It was structured, intentional. Whatever she was protecting me from had once been part of her life too. The bedtime story might not have been something she invented. It might have been something she inherited. That realization deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Late one night, unable to sleep, I stood in the hallway outside my old bedroom. The house was quiet, but not empty. It held sound the way memory holds emotion. I felt the same awareness I'd felt as a child, the sense that something was paying attention. Not watching, exactly. Remembering. I didn't go into the room. I wasn't ready. The conflict now lived in a single question that followed me everywhere. Was I meant to remember this story now, or was remembering itself the mistake? Each answer led to the same uncertainty. Either path carried consequences I couldn't see yet. The bedtime story, once a soft whisper in the dark, had become a presence in my waking life. It shaped how I listened, how I waited, how I prepared myself for something unnamed but inevitable. And the most unsettling part was this. The closer I came to remembering the next part, the stronger the feeling became that the story wasn't finished with me yet. From that point on, the nights grew heavier. Not darker, not louder, just fuller, as if the silence itself had weight. I began to notice how the hours after midnight felt different, stretched thin, like time was holding its breath. Sleep became shallow. I drifted in and out, always stopping just before dreams could fully form, as if something was waiting on the other side and I wasn't sure I wanted to meet it yet. The forgotten bedtime story was no longer a memory I was chasing. It was a presence moving closer, step by quiet step. I felt it in the way my thoughts looped back to the same question, in the way my chest tightened whenever I considered asking my mother directly to finish the story. I knew she would refuse, and I knew that refusal would confirm everything. The tension between us grew, without a single argument. It lived in small moments. The way she lingered at my door when she thought I was asleep. The way she flinched when I mentioned dreams. The way her voice dropped whenever night came up in conversation. We were both orbiting the same truth, careful not to collide. One evening, the power went out during a storm. The house fell into darkness, lit only by distant flashes of lightning. It felt familiar in an unsettling way. I could almost hear her voice from years ago, slowing down, choosing words. The past pressed, so close it felt like I could reach out and touch it. We sat in the living room with candles between us. The quiet forced honesty into the space. I asked her calmly if she remembered the bedtime story. I didn't accuse. I didn't push. I just waited. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something different there. Not fear this time. Resignation. She said some stories are told to protect, and some are stopped for the same reason. She said the night listens more closely than people think. She said children understand things adults spend their whole lives trying to forget. Each sentence felt like a step closer to a door neither of us wanted to open. I asked her what the rule was. Her hands tightened around the candle. The flame shook. She told me the rule wasn't about behavior. It was about attention. About what happens when you listen too closely to what the night remembers. She said the story was meant to teach restraint. To teach the child when to stop asking. That answer raised the tension instead of easing it. Because I had never been good at stopping. After that night, my dreams changed. They became clearer, sharper. I saw the child from the story sitting up in bed, no longer confused, no longer afraid. The watcher wasn't outside the room anymore. It was inside, standing where the parent had been. In these dreams, the child understood the rule and chose to test it anyway. I woke each time with the same thought echoing in my mind. The story had reached its turning point. The keywords that haunted me now were choice and consequence. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't a warning meant to be obeyed blindly. It was a challenge, quietly placed in a child's mind, waiting years to be answered. That realization made everything feel urgent, as if time was running out, even though nothing obvious was happening. I began to sense that remembering wasn't passive. It was an act, a decision. Each memory I recovered brought me closer to something irreversible. The night seemed to respond, growing more present, more aware. Sounds carried farther. Silence lasted longer. Even my own breathing felt louder in the dark. The climax hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue. I found myself standing outside my childhood bedroom again, this time with purpose. The door felt heavier than it should have. I knew that stepping inside would change something. Not the room itself, but what it meant, what it held. Behind me, the house was still. Ahead of me, the room waited. I thought about the child I had been, about the parent who stopped the story, about the watcher who remembered what others tried to forget. All the threads of the mystery pulled tight in that moment, stretching toward a single point. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, knowing that once I crossed that threshold, the forgotten bedtime story would no longer stay half-told. And somewhere in the silence, I could feel the night listening, ready to remember the rest out loud. The moment my hand touched the door handle, something shifted behind me. Not a sound, not a movement, but a change in pressure, like the air had thickened. I didn't turn around. I already knew my mother was standing there. I could feel her the way you feel someone watching you, without seeing them. The silence between us was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She said my name once, softly, the way she used to when she didn't want to scare me awake. I asked her why she never finished the bedtime story. There was a long pause. Then she said something I wasn't expecting at all. She said she didn't stop the story. She said the story stopped her. That was the second twist, and it landed harder than anything before it. She told me that the night I remembered wasn't the first time she had told that story. It was the last. She said she had told it once before, years earlier, to another child. A child who listened too closely. A child who didn't stop at the rule. Her voice shook when she said that some stories don't end when the words stop. Some of them keep going, quietly, shaping choices, pulling attention toward places it shouldn't go. I turned slowly then. She looked older in the candlelight, smaller, somehow. Not like a parent protecting a child, but like someone who had already lost a battle and was trying to prevent another. I asked her who the other child was. She didn't answer directly. She said it didn't matter. She said what mattered was that the story was never meant to be remembered alone. It was meant to be contained, shared carefully, forgotten together. That explanation only deepened the conflict, because it suggested that the story wasn't just dangerous, it was incomplete. And incomplete things don't stay quiet forever. I felt a strange pull toward the room, behind the door, stronger now, almost physical. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't just calling to my memory. It was calling to that space, to the place where it had been planted. The keywords that had followed me for weeks, memory, night, watcher, rule, suddenly felt like pieces of a map. My mother stepped closer, blocking the doorway. She said if I went in there, I wouldn't just remember the story. I would add to it. I would become part of what the night remembers. That was the moment the stakes became clear. This wasn't about understanding my past anymore. It was about deciding whether the story would continue through me, whether I would repeat the pattern, knowingly or not, whether forgetting was an act of fear or an act of responsibility. I asked her why she had told me the story at all, if it was so dangerous. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said, because some children are already listening before the story begins. Because pretending they aren't doesn't protect them. Because the story wasn't meant to open a door, it was meant to teach how to close one. That answer felt incomplete, carefully shaped, like the rest of her silence. As she spoke, I realized something unsettling. The story hadn't just resurfaced because I was ready. It had resurfaced because the night had been waiting for a moment when the rule could be tested again, waiting for someone who remembered just enough to be curious. The house around us felt different now. Too quiet. The familiar sounds, pipes settling, wood shifting, were gone. It was as if the building itself was listening, holding on to every word, every breath. I told her I had been dreaming about the child breaking the rule. Her face drained of color. She said those dreams weren't memories. They were previews. That was when I understood the second plot twist fully. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't just about the past. It was about timing. It resurfaced when a choice had to be made, when attention reached a certain point, when forgetting was no longer possible. The watcher in the story wasn't passive. It responded to awareness. The more you noticed it, the clearer it became. And once it became clear enough, it expected something in return. I asked her what happened to the other child. She said the story didn't take them. It followed them. The tension reached a breaking point then, stretching thin and sharp. I could feel it in my chest, in my hands, in the space between my thoughts. Everything led back to the door, to the room, to the part of the story that had never been spoken out loud. My mother stepped aside slowly, reluctantly, like she knew she couldn't stop this anymore. She said she had done what she could. She had delayed it, softened it, buried it under years of ordinary life. But stories meant to be forgotten don't disappear. They wait for the right listener. I pushed the door open. The room looked exactly the same. Same walls, same window, same shadows stretching across the floor. But the feeling was different, charged, alert, like the room recognized me. Behind me, my mother said one last thing. She said the rule wasn't don't remember. The rule was don't listen alone. And as I stepped inside, the night seemed to lean closer, ready to remind me why. The moment I stepped fully into the room, the air changed. It wasn't colder or warmer, just sharper, like everything had come into focus at once. The shadows along the wall stopped shifting and held their shape. The window reflected more than the dark outside. It reflected me, standing where the child in the story had once stood, finally awake to what had been waiting. I didn't hear a voice at first. I felt pressure, like a thought forming that wasn't entirely mine. The night wasn't speaking in words. It was offering memory. Pieces of the bedtime story slid into place, not as sentences, but as understanding. The rule came back to me clearly now. The rule was never about silence. It was about sharing. The story had been created long ago as a way to carry something heavy without letting it consume one person. It was meant to be told gently, passed carefully, remembered together. The watcher wasn't a thing that hunted. It was a keeper, a holder of memory, waiting for someone to listen responsibly. And the danger came when someone listened alone. I finally understood why my mother had stopped the story. not because it was evil, but because she had been left to carry it by herself once. The other child she mentioned wasn't taken. They had grown up burdened, isolated by what they knew, unable to explain it without sounding afraid or strange. The story followed them because no one else shared it with them. My mother had seen that happen. And when she saw the same awareness spark in me, she panicked. She tried to bury the story instead of finishing it properly. She tried to protect me by cutting a thread instead of tying it off. That choice was the real mistake. The climax wasn't a sudden event. It was a quiet collision of truth. I felt the weight lift slightly as understanding settled in. The night didn't want fear. It wanted balance. Memory divided, not hoarded. I turned back toward the door and spoke my mother's name. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She stepped into the room slowly, like someone approaching a place they'd sworn never to return to. I told her I remembered the rest now. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look afraid anymore. She looked relieved. Together, standing in that small bedroom, we finished what had been left unfinished. Not by repeating the old words, but by acknowledging what the story was meant to do. We named it. We shared it. We let it exist openly instead of hiding it in silence. The watcher faded, not disappearing, but settling, like something finally put down after being carried too long. The tension that had followed me for years loosened its grip. The nights didn't feel empty anymore, but they didn't feel crowded either. They felt honest. I thought that was the end. That would have been a clean resolution. A lesson learned. A story closed. But stories meant to be forgotten never end that neatly. As I turned to leave the room, a final realization struck me, sharp and unexpected. The story hadn't resurfaced just because I was ready. It had resurfaced because someone else was listening now. Not in the house. Not even in my family. The forgotten bedtime story wasn't singular. It was a pattern, reappearing wherever someone reached the same point of awareness. Wherever silence had been used instead of sharing. Wherever a rule had been misunderstood. I understood then why telling this story felt necessary. Why it pressed to be spoken aloud. Why it refused to stay private. The final twist wasn't that the story was dangerous. It was that it was unfinished everywhere. By remembering it, by sharing it, I hadn't ended the story. I had reopened it, not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever felt the night listening and didn't know why. As I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, the house felt lighter, but the world beyond it felt larger. The night no longer leaned in close. It listened from a distance, waiting to see who would listen next, and whether they would listen alone. In the days that followed, life didn't snap back into place the way stories sometimes pretend it does. There was no sudden peace, no perfect calm. Instead, things settled slowly, like dust after something heavy has been moved. The house felt different, not because it had changed, but because the silence inside it no longer felt guarded. It was just silence again. Ordinary. Human. My mother slept through the night for the first time in years. I noticed it in small ways, how she stopped checking the hallway light, how she no longer paused outside my door as if listening for something only she could hear. When I asked her how she felt, she didn't reach for careful words anymore. She said she felt lighter. Not free, exactly, but no longer alone with what she knew. That mattered more than I expected. We talked more after that. Not just about the bedtime story, but about everything it had pushed aside. Her childhood fears. The pressure of being the one who remembered. The quiet responsibility she carried without realizing it had shaped her whole life. She admitted she thought silence was the same as protection. She said she now understood that silence can be its own kind of burden. That admission closed a loop I didn't know was still open. As for me, the nights changed too. I still noticed them more than most people do. I still felt more awake when the world slowed down. But the tension was gone. The feeling that I was missing something important faded, replaced by a steady sense of understanding. The night didn't feel like it was watching anymore. It felt like it had finished its work. The forgotten bedtime story stopped haunting my dreams. When it appeared, it no longer came in fragments or warnings. It arrived whole, calm, complete. Not as something to fear, but as something that had finally been understood. I realized then that the watcher had never been separate from us. It was simply awareness passed forward without context, memory without explanation. Once it had a name and a place, it no longer needed to press so close. The other questions answered themselves quietly. The other child my mother mentioned wasn't lost. They hadn't disappeared or been taken by anything mysterious. They had lived a life shaped by something they couldn't explain, carrying a sense of unease they never fully understood. My mother eventually reached out to them years ago, not with a story, but with empathy. That connection mattered. It always had, even if it came late. I understood then that the story didn't demand urgency. It demanded care. Telling it wasn't about spreading fear or mystery. It was about honesty, about saying that some memories aren't meant to be locked away, and some stories lose their power only when they're shared openly, without secrecy. That became the final lesson. The bedtime story was meant to be forgotten only in a sense that it wasn't meant to rule anyone's life. It wasn't a prophecy or a curse. It was a tool, one that could hurt if mishandled, but help if understood. Like many things passed from one generation to the next, it carried risk and meaning in equal measure. When I finally left the house for good, I didn't look back with fear or hesitation. The room at the end of the hallway was just a room again, a place where something important once happened, and then ended the way it was supposed to. I've told this story carefully, not as a warning meant to scare, and not as a mystery meant to trap anyone's attention. I've told it because stories like this don't disappear just because we ignore them. They fade only when they're understood. If there's a takeaway here, it's simple. Pay attention to what you're taught in quiet moments. Ask why certain stories stop halfway through. Notice what makes people uncomfortable to explain. Those gaps often hold more truth than the loud parts ever do. And if you ever feel like the night is listening, like silence is heavier than it should be, remember this. You're not meant to carry everything alone. Some memories only lose their weight when they're shared. The forgotten bedtime story no longer follows me. It stays where it belongs now, not buried, not hidden, but complete. And for the first time, when the lights go out, sleep comes easily.